All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today we get into the graphs of sine and cosine. We're going to do cosine first, but we're going to be using the unit circle here, okay? So let's take a look at the unit circle first before we graph these. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and label this like we have on the unit circle. We're just going to do the four quadrants here. 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi, okay? So that's 0, pi over 2 or 90 degrees, and then pi, and then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. Okay? And so again, for cosine at 0 radians, 0 cosine is 1. So we're going to go ahead and put a point right up here. Okay? Now in between here would be these three angles here, the pi over 6, the pi over 4, and the pi over 3, but we're not going to include this. We're going to jump straight to pi over 2. At pi over 2, cosine is 0. So at pi over 2, it hits the x-axis right there, okay? Now, at pi, that's over here. At pi, now cosine is -1. So here we're going to go to -1 right there, okay? Now, let's go to 3 pi over 2, which is at the bottom here. At 3 pi over 2, cosine is 0. So at 3 pi over 2, we're going to be at 0 again. Okay? And we're almost around the circle. Notice we started here. We went 1, 2. We're at here right now. Now we're going to go all the way around. At 2 pi, we're back at 1 where we started. So at 2 pi, we are up here. Okay? So I have these 4 points. 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, 5 points. I forgot to count the first one here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then I went all the way around the circle, but on the graph, it's going to look like this. Watch it. Let's connect it with a nice curve. Okay. That is one full cycle of cosine. It starts at 1, goes to 0, goes to -1, comes back up to 0, and then back up to 1, back where it started. Okay, so this is the starting of one cycle, and then this is the ending of one cycle. This is what we call a period. Okay, so from here to here, that is one complete period. Now, if we were to continue this again, it would follow the same pattern. Okay, so notice we started at the top, and then we go to the x-axis. So we start at the top, and we go to the x-axis. And then we go under the x-axis at -1. So right here, we're at -1. Okay. And then we come back up to the x-axis. And then we end up back at the top on the next point there. So like that. Okay. So notice here, if I were to connect these points again, it would look like this. Okay. So here I completed 2 cycles or 2 periods. This is the first period right here. From here to here, that's one period. Okay. And then from here to here, that's another period. Okay. Notice it's the same pattern here. It started at the top, it dipped, then it came back up, and it finished, right where it started. And then we continued it again. If we were to extend this further, then that would be another period, okay? So we are only interested in one period for today. Now, let's do the same thing with sine. Now, I'm going to label this the same way I did up there. This is going to be pi over 2, this is going to be pi, then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. If I wanted to continue this here, notice each little segment here is half pi or pi over 2. So think of this as 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2. But wait a minute, 6 over 2, that's 3 pi, right? So that just reduces to 3 pi. So we have 5 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2, and then 8 pi over 2. But again, I can reduce this. 8 pi over 2 just becomes 4 pi. So I don't need the improper fraction there, okay? Because it actually reduced. And that would have been the same thing here. I would have had 5 pi over 2, 3 pi, 7 pi over 2, and then 4 pi. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and graph this, okay? So remember, using the unit circle here, sine starts at 0. So sine goes right there. Oh, I forgot to put here, it goes from 1 to -1, okay? Those are our maximum and our minimums here. Okay, so now notice here, it starts at 0. And then at pi over 2, what happens? At pi over 2, sine is at 1. So at pi over 2, it goes up to 1. So it starts from 0 and then climbs up to 1. What happens at pi? At pi, sine, this one's the sine there, is at 0. It goes back down to 0. So it goes back down. Okay? What about at 3 pi over 2? 3 pi over 2 is down here. Sine is at -1. So now it goes under to -1. And then at 2 pi, we complete the cycle. We're back where we started. So remember, 0 and 2 pi is back where we started. Okay, so where we start and where we end. So 0. So we're at 0 here. So notice here, if I were to connect these here, these points, I want to connect it with a smooth curve. That would be 1 period. So from here to there is 1 period. So here, notice here, if we were to do another period, we would start here at 0. Okay, there it is. And then we would move 1 over, and then that would be up at 1. And we would move 1 over, we're at 0. And then we would move 1 over, we're at the bottom here. And then 1 more over, it would be back where we started at 0. Okay, so let's connect these points with a smooth curve. And there it is. There's the next period. So it's the same length. Okay, so both of these would be 2 periods, right? But each one is 1 period. So notice it's kind of like an S. So that's one way to remember it. The sine curve starts at the center and it looks like an S. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so and then it repeats again. Up, down, under, back to the center. Okay, the cosine starts at the top, goes under, comes back up to the top, and ends back where it started, okay? So that's the difference between cosine and sine, okay? One period of cosine starts at the top, which we call the maximum. This is called the minimum, okay? And so this is called here the midline, the middle line where it kind of cuts it in half, okay? So here we have the maximum, the minimum, and then the midline. Right here, we have the maximum, the minimum, and then the midline that goes right through it. So now let's go ahead and take a look at these 3 terms here that we're going to need to find on the graphs. Okay, so here we have the midline, the amplitude, and the period. Okay, so let's begin with the midline and then we'll do these 2 last. Okay, so we have the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2. So in other words, add the maximum and the minimum and then divide by 2. So this little formula is what we're going to be using to find the midline. So let's go ahead and do that right here. Okay, we have a bunch of graphs. We have 6 in total. Okay, the maximum is going to be the highest point on the graph. So notice here, the maximum happens at 2. Okay, so our maximum is 2. Okay, remember the formula here. We're going to add the maximum and the minimum and then divide by 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and add that to the minimum. The minimum here is -4. Notice here, -4, that's the lowest point. So plus -4. And then let's divide by 2. This will be our midline, okay? Let me just put here, midline. And so let's go ahead and add 2 plus -4 is going to be -2. Divided by 2, we get -1. Okay, so our midline is actually right here. I'm going to go ahead and do that with a dotted line all the way across. That's my midline, okay? Now notice here, this one starts at the midline. Which one of these 2 starts at the midline, the cosine or the sine? Notice here, the midline is right here, and the midline is right here. Let me do it in blue here. Right? The cosine does not start at the midline, it starts at the maximum. The sine starts at the midline, as you can see right here. Okay? So this is an example of a sine curve. Okay? Notice it looks very different. than this sine curve here. Okay? And then we'll explain why they look different after in the next video, okay? Now, let's just go ahead and calculate the midline for all of these. So again, we take our maximum. Our maximum here, notice, is at 0. Our maximum, the highest point here is 0, so it's 0. So let's do the midline. I'll just put M at MDLN, midline. And so this will be 0 plus, and then our minimum is going to be -4. So I'll put here -4, and then divided by 2. So 0 plus -4 is going to be -4, and -4 divided by 2 is going to be -2. So my midline here is right there. Okay. Again, the sine curve starts at the midline. Okay. Then it goes up, down, and so on. Okay. So this one is also a sine curve. Okay. So I'll just write this right here. This is a sine curve. This is a sine curve also. Okay. Let's do the next one here. Again, we're just finding the midline. Take a look here. This is 5, the maximum, and this is -1, the minimum. Okay, so I'll do the math down here. So this will be 5 plus -1, okay? And then we're going to divide by 2. I'll just do capital M right there. So midline is going to be 5, the maximum, right? And then the minimum, and then divided by 2. So 5 plus -1 is going to be 4, and 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay, so this is my midline. I'm going to go ahead and label it with a dotted line. Okay, that's all we're doing. Now notice here, this one, the curve does not start at the midline. So that means this is a cosine graph. Okay, so the next one here. This is a shorter one. Notice here we have -1 and -3. So let's go ahead and do the math here. So -1 is the maximum. -3 is the minimum. So -1 plus -3, and then divided by 2. Okay, so -1 plus -3 is -4 divided by 2, and then we end up with -2. So this is my midline, -2. Now, I forgot to mention here that the equation of the midline would be not just -2, but it would be y equals -2. So this one here would be y equals +2. And then I forgot to do it on these two. This would be y equals -1. And then over here, y equals -2. That would be your equation for the midline, because it's basically a horizontal line where y is that value every single length of the line. Okay, so -2, -1, and so on. Okay, 2 more, which you probably already got this, but let's go ahead and do it anyway. Okay, so we have 4 is our maximum. So our midline is going to be 4 plus, and then our minimum is 0, so 4 plus 0, and then divided by 2. 4 plus 0 is 4, divided by 2, we get 2. Okay, so we're going to write y equals 2. So let's go ahead and show this with a dotted line on the graph. Okay, and then finally here we have, oh, I didn't label this one here. Let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and then -1, -2, -3, -4. Okay, so this is going to be 4 plus -4, so 4 plus -4 divided by 2. Okay, well, 4 plus -4, that's 0. 0 divided by 2, that's still 0. So my equation is going to be y equals 0. In other words, the x-axis is my midline. Okay, and notice this one starts at the midline, so this is a sine curve. Okay, this one didn't start at the midline, so it started at the maximum, so this is a cosine curve. And then back over here, we already said that one was a cosine. Notice this one starts at the midline, so that one's a sine curve. Okay, so now let's talk about amplitude. The amplitude is the distance from the midline to the maximum or to the minimum, because it's going to be the same thing. And then we're talking about vertical distance here, okay? So let's take a look at that. Notice here, here's our midline. We outlined it here with a dotted line. And so from the midline to the maximum, how far is it away? Notice it's going to be 1, 2, 3. So my amplitude here is 3. Notice I could do it from here also to the minimum. 1, 2, 3. So again, the amplitude is just basically the distance from the midline to one of the maximums or one of the minimums. So 1, 2, 3, it doesn't matter which one you choose, it's going to be the same amount, okay? So here we're going to say the amplitude is 3. And the amplitude will always be a positive number. It will never be a negative number because we're talking about length, okay? Notice here from the midline here. So once you find the midline, it's easy to calculate the amplitude. Just count 1, 2. So the amplitude here, we'll just say amplitude is 2. Okay? Let's do all the other ones. Right here from the midline, it's going to be 1, 2, 3. So my amplitude is 3. Just as simple as that. Right here, the midline is right there. The amplitude is up 1, so it's 1 right there. So the amplitude, again, remember, is always positive. It's a distance. So this is just going to be 1. Okay? And then the last two here, amplitude from the midline to the maximum, it's going to be 2 here. So that's going to be 2. And then right here, from the midline, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So the amplitude here is 4. Again, we don't say -4. We just say 4 because it's a length, okay? And finally, the period. We talked about this at the beginning, but let's go over it again in detail here. It says the distance it takes to complete a full cycle before it starts a new cycle all over again. Okay, so remember, this is just a repeating pattern, a repeating cycle. And so we need to find the start and the end of each cycle, and that is what we call a period. Okay, so let's take a look at this here. Now, we said this is a cosine curve. So this means that we started at the maximum, okay? So at the maximum, notice here, we want to end up back where we started at the maximum. So if we go down this curve here, and we come back up, we finish the cycle. Notice, we repeat it again. We come down and up, down and up. So this one actually has 3 periods, right? So we have 1, 2, 3. Now to calculate the period, we just need to find the cycle for one period, okay? So here we go, we start from 0, okay? Remember, this was our midline, okay? But still, it's going to be 0 radian, so that's 0 on the x-axis, okay? And then we finish the cycle at pi over 2, okay? So we say the period is pi over 2, okay? So from here to here, that's when it started and that's when it ended. It took pi over 2 to complete the cycle, okay? Let's look at this one here. This one started at the midline, so that's a sine curve now. Notice here, so it's going to complete a letter S. So go like this, like a backward S, right? And so it has to end right where it started. So notice here, it starts in the middle, so we got to go up. We passed the middle here, but remember, we have not formed the letter S yet. That just kind of forms a little mountain. We have to do over and under, and then we finish here. So this is actually at 2 pi. So the period here is 2 pi. Okay? And so notice, we have a period here, and then we go up, down again. We have another period there at 4 pi, and then we finish here with the last cycle. So that's 3 periods. 1, 2, 3. All right, next one here. So notice here we have a sine curve, right? Why? Because it starts at the midline. Okay, so it goes up, back to the middle where it started from, but then we go under, and then we complete the cycle by finishing where we started, right at the midline. Okay, so this would be one cycle there, one period. So the period here is pi over 3. Okay, what about here? Okay, again, it starts at the midline, so that means we need a full letter S here, so like this. And so this would be my period. Period is pi. Okay, and let's finish here. We have here, this one starts at the top. Notice the midline is right there. And so the cycle starts at the top here, at cosine, at the maximum. So notice here, we're going to start at the top and end at the top. So we're going to go down, up, and finish right there. So this one finishes at 4 pi. So this period is 4 pi. And then finally here, notice here, this one starts at the midline, so this is a sine curve. So we're going to go up, down, and up, form a full letter S. And notice here, that's just one period right there. So the period here is 2 pi. So I'll just write it right here. The period is 2 pi. And notice we have half of another period here. The other half would have been continuing down here and then back over here off to the side. Okay, so this one actually does not have another cycle, another full cycle. Okay, so we just have one period here. The period takes 2 pi. And that's it.